Hi, I'm Adrian Green, the director of the Salisbury Museum. I have a background in archaeology and look after a museum with a collection packed full of incredible finds from the local area. In my spare time I love exploring local archaeological sites, so today we're going to look at Figsbury Ring, which is a prehistoric site just northeast of Salisbury town centre. So, we've just come through Winterbourne-Dauncey, and in fact the railway line between Salisbury and London is literally in front of me here. Behind me you can see Figsbury Ring. It's up there on the hill, it's that dark band. And it sits about 500 feet above sea level. It has a commanding position overlooking the Bourne Valley on a chalk promontory, so it's very powerfully located in the landscape. And there's a lot of other archaeology around here as well. Of course we have Old Sarum, just to the west of here, about 2.5 miles away. There used to be an Iron Age hill fort, and of course the home of Salisbury until 1220 when it moved to its current location. And just to the south we have a Roman road that links up Old Sarum with Winchester, and beyond that the Clarendon Park estate and Fussel's Lodge, which is a really important Neolithic long barrow. Now, when you look on old maps and antiquarian accounts of Figsbury Ring, it's often referred to as Chlorus's camp. And that's because it was believed it was associated with a man called Constantius Chlorus. He was a leader in the Western Roman Empire in the late 3rd century, and he came to this country to crush a rebellion by Electus and Carausius, who were these two leaders who wanted to create a breakaway Western Roman Empire. They completely failed because Chlorus came here and he defeated them. And it was thought in the past that earthworks like Figsbury Ring were associated with the Roman period and with Chlorus in particular and the work that he did. But as you'll see when we go up there in a moment, very little dates back to the Roman period. In fact, it is much, much older. So, behind me here are the outer earthworks of Figsbury Ring. It is an earthen enclosure of about 6 hectares, circular in shape with 2 entrances. One on the western side, which is the one behind me here, and another over on the eastern side. There is also an element of the rampart that's been removed, and we think that happened later on. We think these are the 2 principal entrances opposite each other. Now, it basically consists of a bank, a rampart, and an outer ditch, and both of those were excavated in the 1920s by Ben and Maud Cunnington. And what they discovered was that originally the ditch was really finely cut, V-shaped in section. It was about 10 metres wide and about 4 metres deep, and that the rampart had been reinforced with chalk on a couple of occasions, possibly out of the outer ditch. Now, in terms of dating material, they found evidence that dated this site, or these earthworks, back to the earlier Iron Age, between about 500 and 800 BC. That's over 2,500 years ago. But what they didn't find though was they found very little evidence of occupation, particularly from inside the earthworks. There were no evidence of permanent structures, no evidence of pits. So it seems as if this site may well have been only used on sort of temporary occasions. Perhaps it was a temporary camp or a shelter. Some were even for taking animals in times of trouble if there are people out there trying to steal them. It was not permanently occupied. But we have to imagine, if we're standing here about 2,500 years ago, that this of course would have been gleaming white, made out of chalk. The ditch would have been kept clean, and there could have been, although there is no evidence for this, a fence running along the top of the rampart, a palisade, and possibly a gate as well behind me here to stop people from getting in and perhaps to stop animals from getting out. But the most interesting thing about this site is another earthwork which we need to look at inside. So the interesting thing is there's this inner ditch. It's circular in plan. There is an entrance corresponding on each side with the outer earthworks. But it is a long way in. It's about 30 metres away from the outer rampart. Now, archaeologists used to think that this was a quarry, effectively to provide more material, more chalk to reinforce the outer rampart, and of course there's evidence to show that it had been reinforced. But it doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? It's a long way away, 30 metres, to take the chalk away. Why not just dig it out of the outer ditch? That would make a lot more sense. There's also the character of this ditch, which is very different to the outer ditch. It is not finely cut, it's not V-shaped in section, it's actually quite wide at the bottom. So it looks very different, and also it's irregularly cut as well. So there are lots of promontories and causeways, and bits are unfinished about it. In fact, there's a whole section of about 18 metres of it that looks unfinished. And then finally, perhaps the most compelling thing about this is the archaeological finds, because these seem to date back to an earlier period. We've got late Neolithic, early Bronze Age pottery coming out of this ditch. So that would suggest that this feature is perhaps 2,000 years older than the outer earthwork. It is an earlier feature in the monument. So we have a conundrum here because we have two different periods to this site. We have this outer bank or rampart that I'm standing on that dates back to the earlier Iron Age with an outer ditch. And then we have this inner ditch on the left hand side, which is a long way away from where we're standing. And it appears to be earlier, almost certainly Neolithic in date. So there's a number of theories here about what's going on. There was definitely an earlier site here that was later occupied in the Iron Age. But what happened? Perhaps this feature here was a causewayed enclosure dating back to the early Neolithic. The structure of it, the character of it might suggest that, but there's very little archaeological material to back that up. The second possibility is that this earlier feature was a henge monument. Obviously not one that involved a timber circle or a stone circle. There are henges in this country that don't involve those structures because by definition a henge is an inner ditch with an outer bank. But then there's a problem, because where is this outer bank? Well, the possibility is, of course, that we're actually standing on it, because we know that this rampart had two phases. It's possible that within here there is an earlier Bronze Age or later Neolithic bank. Yes, it is a long way for the inner ditch, but this is a henge monument. This is a ceremonial site. It is a focal point in the landscape, a special place. They don't have to follow the rules of how they all were constructed. This may be an exception to the rule, but it fits with the evidence. It is a possibility. Then, of course, later on in the Iron Age, it was then reused as a settlement, as a temporary camp, and it was reinforced. That explains how this earlier earthwork, or rather this later earthwork, respects the structure of this site. But of course, the problem is we're never going to know the answers to these questions because this site is protected. It's a scheduled ancient monument. It's not at risk of being destroyed by road building or house construction. So many of these questions are going to remain unanswered. There is not going to be an excavation anytime soon, so Figsbury is going to keep its secrets for many more years to come. But that's perhaps no bad thing, because we can come here, it is an unbelievably special place, and we can appreciate why it was so important to our ancestors.